Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today our webinar on battle-tested strategies for evidence synthesis, mastering systematic reviews for regulatory purposes. I'm Bob Ayen. I lead the team here at Rayyan. We're the hosts for today. And joining us to present are Drs. Isabella Steffensen, the President and CEO of TheraBusiness, and Dr. Mimi Kim, Vice President for Scientific Affairs and Strategic Growth with TheraBusiness. They are evidence synthesis experts who will be sharing with us today what they've learned from their long experience in delivering regulatory compliant reports and evidence synthesis projects for regulated biomedical entities and others. And if I could ask Mimi, if you'd like to just say a few words about why today's topic is important to the audience that we're speaking to, then we can get started with the rest of our webinar.
Terrific. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Here, let me just share my screen. Everyone can see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so welcome, everyone. First, thank you to our Rayyan partners for giving us the opportunity to collaborate on this webinar today. We're delighted to have you all join us today to talk about one of our favorite methodological topics, systematic reviews. More specifically, today we'll be discussing systematic reviews as the battle-tested strategy for evidence synthesis and the how and the why this methodology can be a useful regulatory solution for all of you. I'm Dr. Mimi Kim. As Bob had shared, I'm Vice President of Scientific Affairs and Strategic Growth at TheraBusiness, and I'll be presenting the first portion of the webinar today, and then Dr. Isabella Steffensen will continue with some deeper knowledge of the methodology in the EU MDR context. We welcome questions and ask that you provide them in the chat so we can address them at the end of the webinar as time allows.
Great. Thank you, Mimi. Also joining us from the Rayyan side is Ray Prue, Director of Sales for the Americas, and Mark Kaylard, Vice President of Global Partnerships. Rayyan is really on a mission to accelerate research around the world, and we do that with our research collaboration platform. We've developed a partnership with TheraBusiness so that we can provide a more comprehensive solution for research organizations around the world who need regulatory compliant evidence synthesis solutions, both in terms of technology and methodology. And I'd like first to ask Mimi just one quick question while we're getting started. Why is this discussion important today for regulated biomedical entities? What's at stake in terms of their financial future?
I'll say quite a bit about it as we progress through the presentation, but what I can say initially is hopefully you all will walk away from this getting a clearer understanding of how deeply a systematic review can inform all of your regulatory efforts, and how those tentacles of the systematic review can impact your work going forward, as well as the evidence base overall. So we will be providing a significant level of detail on the sort of potential value add benefits of the systematic review process.
Fantastic. And so next up, maybe will you continue, or shall we hear from Isabella?
No, I'm happy to continue, and I just for everyone in the audience, I'll turn off my camera so that you can just focus on the content that we're sharing. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, visible to everyone?
It is.
Okay. So I just wanted to first off get us all on the same page when we talk about this partnership. Rayyan, as far as Rayyan and TheraBusiness, it's a formal partnership that was announced on September 29th of this year, and it's a collaboration that we find truly sweet. Here's a brief snippet from the press release from September 29th, where we announced this exclusive strategic partnership. But I believe I speak for both companies when I share our delight on this formal relationship, as it's built from a mutual commitment to provide a comprehensive suite of services, as Bob stated, But the suite of services is a shared vision for delivering the most robust regulatory solutions possible by offering both the strength of a software platform for systematic reviews, as well as the methodological rigor following the strictest of guidelines, which is a core service at TheraBusiness. So TheraBusiness was started by Dr. Isabella Steffensen, who's on the webinar today and will be presenting in later on, in 1996 as a division of MetaBusiness. In 2011, TheraBusiness became a standalone company, and as of today, Thera is on a positive upward trajectory of growth in terms of providing regulatory scientific solutions to a very diverse portfolio of clients. I don't know where the header is for this. This is Dr. Isabella Steffensen. A bit to share about her. She's our CEO and president, as well as founder, as I just mentioned. She is a trained cellular biologist trained at the University of Ottawa. She has over 25 years of experience scientifically supporting multiple industries and has extensive and deep expertise across the life sciences sector. Apologies for that unexpected animation there. I am Mimi Kim, and I have a health services research training background that started at Columbia University in New York City and culminated at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for my doctorate and my postdoctoral training at Duke University Medical Center in the Department of Psychiatry. I have over 20 years of experience across the spectrum of methodology, from conceptualization to execution and through dissemination. Here, we're providing a very broad overview of the scientific solutions we provide at TheraBusiness that's really span the regulatory spectrum. And this is just to give you an idea. But again, today we're really going to be focused on the systematic review methodology expertise. Here's another perspective on our experience at TheraBusiness. In the figure on the right, you can see that TheraBusiness has delivered across a large number of therapeutic areas. But in looking at the figure on your left, though the pie chart does segment our work areas, what it doesn't convey is how much the various methodological areas we work in are interrelated. This raises a critical point in terms of systematic reviews, because the majority, if not all, of our systematic reviews have informed directly on other projects, particularly our study design and study execution projects. And you will see later in the presentation that the impact of systematic reviews is quite broad and deep, as I had hinted at in my response to Bob's first question. Now, to look at systematic reviews in a broader context, as shown here on the left, all reviews have a purpose, and as all reviews have a certain associated methodology, the methodology also has direct implications on confidence. As I've shown here, systematic reviews yield the highest level of confidence across all reviews. On the right side of the slide, we see the hierarchy, also known as the pyramid of scientific evidence, which came from the 2009 FDA draft guidance on evaluation of health claims. Looking at the pyramid, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen at some point, systematic reviews are at the top of the hierarchy of evidence pyramid, with meta-analyses grounded in systematic reviews at the very top, defining the highest level of evidence. This represents the evaluation process to assess scientific studies and other data. In this evaluation process, one goal is to eliminate studies from which no conclusions about the substance, disease, etc. relationship can be drawn. The process also involves rating methodological quality and evaluating the strength of the totality of scientific evidence. So as you move up the pyramid, the rigor and strength of the totality of evidence increases. As defined by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the nuts and bolts of systematic review methodology are transparent and replicable, a priori defined protocol, documented literature search, audit trail of study selection, and critical appraisal of the evidence base. Here's a brief slide of some resources that provide guidance on some of the tools and best practices out there for conducting systematic reviews. I'll pause here just for a moment in case anyone wants to jot down some quick notes. And in no way is this list exhaustive. Moving on, Here is a figure that provides a different perspective on the key components of the systematic review process, beginning with review initiation through the multiple subsequent steps, including identifying the review question and methodology, defining the search strategy, documenting all descriptives on study characteristics, rating the quality of the evidence base both at the individual study level and evidence base overall, synthesizing all of this, and ending with the direct application of the review. The application will be a point that we expand on here in just a moment. But first, I wanted to point out some basic differences in two of the most common types of reviews: the narrative literature review and the systematic review, with or without meta-analysis. In looking at this table, consider that this is not intended to present that one approach is necessarily stronger than the other. Rather, what I'd like to emphasize is that the objectives are different. And in my view, understanding the differences allows us to maximize the opportunity for each approach by keeping the objectives of each in mind. So more specifically, though a systematic review is intended for replication, literature reviews may not be, and are most often not. Some of the other differences beyond replication include specification of selection criteria. Additionally, appraisal, which is a significant difference between the two approaches because there are standardized instruments to assess risk of bias and strength of evidence in systematic reviews. Further, in terms of inferences, when it comes to systematic reviews and meta-analyses, when we talk about evidence-based inferences, we can have more confidence in the inferences from systematic reviews because the methodology requires specificity of parameters. Whereas with literature reviews, evidence-based inferences are not necessarily a requirement, nor are they necessarily methodical. Going a bit deeper, in terms of systematic reviews exclusively, there are many types. On this slide, we identify effectiveness, experiential, cost economic evaluation, prevalence/incidence, and diagnostic test accuracy reviews. You can note the different aims, but more specifically, I'd like to draw your attention to the difference in question formats. Continuing on to the next slide with even more types. We have here etiology, expert opinion, psychometric, prognostic, and methodological reviews. Again, I want to highlight the differences in question format, which is the foundation of your systematic review process and protocol. So here are the components of the first step in a systematic review, which is the protocol registration. Any deviation from the protocol, such as the addition of even a single measure, requires a protocol update. So first, when specifying your key question, you think about the PICO, which stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcomes as defined and declared by AHRQ. I provided a template key question above where you might be examining a differential impact between X product and Y product for a specific outcome of interest. Then the protocol specifies the search strategy, the databases, all study eligibility, data to be extracted, and a very general overview of the data to be reported. Another optional aspect of systematic reviews, and again, I repeat optional, is contextual questions, which can provide additional consideration around findings. In many of my own previous reviews, we have addressed contextual questions to provide consideration of reliability and validity of specific measures. For example, we gathered evidence on the validity and reliability of the measures specified in the evidence for that specific review. But what I want to say in terms of this slide is how important it is that the systematic review process has been designed with the objective of full transparency and replicability with techniques that are intended to be standardized for critical appraisal. As I've stated, one critical measurement or requirement of systematic review methodology is appraisal. And we will begin with measuring risk of bias at the individual study level. There are many instruments out there, and Downs and Black checklist is just one example. but it is one of the most widely used risk of bias instruments out there because the individual items are straightforward and its appraisal applies to both randomized controlled trials and observational studies. In general, non-systematic reviews are more at risk for bias because, for instance, there isn't a methodology in place for retrieving or selecting studies. An example of bias would be if a published review that failed to consider another systematic review on the same topic. Though the source of that bias may be unknown even at the end of your evidence synthesis process, it is still important to consider the exclusion of a relevant review in your appraisal process. Moving on, strength of evidence is another aspect of standardized appraisal and systematic reviews. This appraisal is based on, the appraisal I've presented here is based on the grade system as defined by AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And it captures a systematic and explicit approach to assess the extent to which one can be confident that an estimate of effect is near the true value for an outcome. Methodological flaws within studies, consistency of results across studies, generalizability of research results to the broader population, and how effective the treatments have been shown to be. Based on this grade approach, the evidence for a given outcome is graded according to the specific levels of strength. You can see that with a high grade, we can conclude, quote, confidence that the estimate of effect lies close to the true effect, close quote. Whereas with low, the evidence is characterized by limited confidence that the estimate of effect lies close to the true effect. Hold on about that. So as I mentioned, there are many different tools out there. So here I show you on this slide and the next slide several different appraisal options to give you a sense of how varying appraisal options can be and how carefully we need to all be when deciding on the tool for appraisal because their application is very prescribed. For example, the ROB2 is an assessment specific to a single trial result. But there is also the Robbins I, which is for critical appraisal of non-randomized observational studies. Going further, the CEBM is actually specifically for therapy or prevention, etiology or harm, prognosis, diagnosis, differential diagnosis or symptom prevalence studies, and economic and decision analyses. Continuing on to further example tools, you can see additional options for JADAD, Newcastle, Ottawa, AHRQ checklist, and Quadis 2. In no way is this an exhaustive list, and I provided the citation here at the bottom of the screen, so you can take a look on your own for an even lengthier list of options. But the important thing to note is that carefully understanding your systematic review and the evidence base you are synthesizing will also greatly inform your choice of the appraisal tool. And it is critical to choose and apply the most appropriate appraisal tool to optimize the potential value of your completed evidence synthesis. Once you get to summarizing your data, there is a lot to consider, and it's important to keep in mind two key components of the systematic review methodology that I will echo from earlier in my presentation, which is transparency and replicability. So this list is only an overview because your evidence base will drive how much you need to report for each of these data abstraction components. But you can, in your planning, you should plan, it is extensive. So I've discussed quite a bit here, but I want to shift a bit to how systematic reviews are relevant as a regulatory solution. First, the methodology requires the review team to predefine their search strategy to optimize comprehensiveness, to avoid bias, among other reasons, while also being very targeted according to your PICO, and that's key, right? Like many things in life, it's a balance between quantity and quality. But going down the systematic review pathway also offers an opportunity to establish a living system that is transparent. This living system is especially relevant to those of us working in regulated industries because so many evidence bases are rapidly evolving in parallel with an ever-evolving regulatory landscape. By conducting a systematic review, you are putting in a tremendous front-end effort to provide the highest level of evidence that can also be continuously updated to provide the most up-to-date state of the evidence, while also assuring regulators that it's a transparent and replicable process. So now we will shift to looking at the potential broad impact of systematic reviews within the regulatory landscape, and a few regulatory case examples we've identified to illustrate why systematic reviews are regulatory relevant and how they have been used in the past by some regulatory authorities that we are all familiar with. So first, I'm providing you with I realize this figure is very dense, but I thought it would be particularly useful for this discussion. This is from an article published by Schuneman and colleagues in 2022, and it presents the ecosystem of health decision-making. This outlines a unifying overview of the bridging of decision-making approaches across disciplines of health decision-making. Here, discipline refers to a specific branch of knowledge and practice of actors that make health decisions. And here we can see that the actors in health decision-making ecosystems formulate questions following the PICO approach. Evidence synthesis executed in systematic reviews can be applied in any of the disciplines that are involved in decision-making, including health technology assessments, clinical practice guidelines, quality assurance and improvement, coverage decisions, essential medicines list decisions, and evidence-informed policy decision-making. Regulators, including those in the fields of environmental health and risk assessment, often use one or a few studies, but might rely on systematic reviews depending on the regulatory context and the available evidence. All of the disciplines have evidence to decision criteria in common, focusing on the problem, health benefits and harms, values, costs, and the certainty in the evidence based on those criteria. Criteria that are more strongly linked to context are often overlapping with disciplines such as cost and feasibility, and across disciplines such as equity, ethics, and acceptability, and could require emphasis depending on the decision-making actor and perspective. Criteria are broadly summarized under social, ethical, legal, feasibility, acceptability, standards, and equity headings. Legal frameworks could prescribe which criteria are relevant for decisions or which criteria must be considered in jurisdictions. All disciplines use some degree of modeling, from very simple to complex models, to understand the consequences. Products include recommendations, decisions, or options described by the various actors. Other disciplines, such as coverage decisions or a national EML, make decisions either directly or based on the recommendations of HTA and guidelines. These decisions are implemented by both health professionals and at the system level. Evidence-informed policy tools lay out contextualized options rather than making specific recommendations. Implementations can take place in the context of research, which together with new evidence completes the evidence generation and synthesis cycle in the updates of decisions. Here's a quote from the FDA's guidance document on evaluation of health claims, which is where the hierarchy of pyramid that I showed earlier also came from. And as you can see highlighted on the slide, the FDA has specified a systematic evaluation of the strength of evidence with a series of steps to assess scientific studies, including rating the methodological quality of studies and evaluating the strength of the totality of evidence. Now, I point this out because I don't know about others, but if I didn't know a thing about systematic review methodology, I could easily interpret this guidance in the sincerest, most qualitative way. Like thinking, sure, I think the studies aren't so great because of X, Y, and Z, but overall, there seems to be some strength in the evidence base because there are a lot of studies reporting on a specific outcome, and the results of those studies are saying similar things. However, this is not what the guidance is talking about. And hopefully, so far, you've gotten a good sense of how prescribed and specific phrases like methodological quality and strength mean very specific things and require specific knowledge and deliberation. So here, moving on, I'm going to provide a few use case examples. So this is an example of a systematic review application in the US with the FDA that was actually quite recent. The FDA had commissioned a systematic review in the context of the launch of the new era of smart food safety and the blueprint in 2020, which was a 10-year plan to create a safer food system. One specific component that the FDA's commission systematic review focused on was supporting and promoting a food safety culture. The key questions of this review are: what is food safety culture? How is food safety culture developed and maintained? And how is food safety culture assessed? Rather than going through each component of their review process, I thought it might be most helpful to provide a sense of the conclusions of the review, because these were conclusions that were directly provided to and for the FDA. So here we see there was a general consensus in the literature on how to define food safety culture and determinants of a strong and effective food safety culture. But the evidence synthesis process also identified gaps in the literature. And this is what I find to be one of the most valuable things about systematic reviews. And I find it valuable because it informs on the methodology that is needed to truly address a regulatory relevant question. This is valuable information to all scientists, right, who are contributing to the evidence base. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, this provides a very valuable foundation for creating a living process for monitoring the progress of a given field on a specific policy relevant outcome. Here, I've identified a couple of examples from the UK. So the first example is a systematic review that was commissioned by the Department of Health and Social Care that looked at tobacco product packaging. Based on this review, the government introduced a standardized plain packaging requirement across tobaccos. And since then, there has been a 2.5% decrease in cigarette smoking related deaths in the UK, with an estimated 25 billion British pounds net benefit to the government by 2026 due to this policy change. Another example of an applied systematic review in the UK was related to hepatitis C. This review was part of an initiative that was launched in 2016 by the World Health Assembly that adopted a global health sector strategy on viral hepatitis for the period 2016 to 2021. This review summarized the scale of the UK hepatitis C challenge in 2016 to help support focused action to eliminate hepatitis C as a major public health threat by 2030. These findings informed the introduction of a 2016 compensation scheme for people accidentally infected with the disease through historical treatments. And latest figures show 535 people in England who have registered to claim an extra 18 plus British pounds for long-term negative effects on their quality of life. This example comes from Canada, a review that was initiated by the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare that was established by the Public Health Agency of Canada to develop clinical practice guidelines. Currently, the task force addresses over 10 therapeutic areas with systematic reviews, including prostate cancer, potentially inappropriate prescriptions and over-the-counter medication use, falls prevention, depression in children and adolescents, tobacco smoking in adults, depression in pregnancy and postpartum, chlamydia and gonorrhea, fragility fractures, asymptomatic thyroid dysfunction, esophageal cancer, and cervical cancer. What I really like about this example is you see how there are strong signals that systematic reviews have become not only established, but a consistent source of information at the system level to inform public health outcomes and policy via informed guidelines. And our final example is from Australia, with a systematic review that was commissioned by the Australian government on a national men's health strategy. In this review, the evidence synthesis was focused on identifying barriers to access to the Australian health system for men and boys, identifying population groups for which barriers to access are more prevalent, and identifying priority areas and opportunities to address these. Here is another example of conclusions that are more psychosocially focused, as opposed to maybe identifying the gaps in the literature base, as we saw in the FDA example. But I like this use case because it provides a very different set of objectives and a different set of conclusions than the other examples. I hope that I have provided you with a helpful overview of the methodology, the potential value of this methodology for your regulatory needs, with supporting specific examples of regulatory purpose with the use cases I identified. I'll now hand this off to Dr. Steffensen, who will take you through the remainder of the presentation into a deep dive of EU MDR systematic review application.
Hi there. Yep, just 1 second. I'm going to share. Here we go. 1 second, please. No, just a sec. Sorry, I'm just having a technical difficulty here. Just 1 minute. Share screen. I'm trying to share this window here.
Well, while we're waiting, thank you, Mimi, for kicking off the discussion and sharing all that background information. As a reminder, we will have time after the discussion for any questions. If anyone has questions for the first section, you could use the Q&A feature to start entering those, and we'll moderate the questions towards the end. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm good to go. Am I sharing?
Yep.
Okay. So I apologize. Mimi, is it possible for you to do this from your end?
Sure, I can do that. We can see your screen though.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want me to take over?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Actually, if it's going now, it's working now.
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it.
Okay, apologies for this. As Mimi, thank you, Dr. Mimi Kim. As Mimi mentioned, I'm Dr. Isabella Steffensen. I'm President and CEO of TheraBusiness. And we're going to discuss now looking at applying utility of the systematic literature review to the EU MDR. So we're going to look at applying utility of the systematic literature review with regards to the new EU medical device regulations. Good scientific literature is essential and valuable in a number of key areas, such as the clinical evaluation report, state-of-the-art reviews, clinical investigations, post-marketing surveillance, and post-marketing clinical follow-up. Detailed plans make for comprehensive evaluations, and defining your protocols and methodologies are important and will allow good practices to cascade throughout your evaluations, surveillance, reports, and updates. So as I mentioned, clinical evaluations is one of the areas where systematic scientific literature reviews can be applied. Requirements indicate a systematic approach is sought, and according to the new EU MDR regulations, they state that you need to identify available clinical data through a systematic scientific literature review. And following, you have to appraise all relevant clinical data and analyze all relevant clinical data in order to reach conclusions. The key area is the state-of-the-art review. The state-of-the-art is referenced 12 times in the new EU MDR compared to 3 times in the previous medical device directive. The benefit risk profile of your device must take into account the state-of-the-art, i.e. what is currently and generally accepted as good practice. A thorough analysis of the current state-of-the-art, including alternative treatments for the specified indication for your device, is expected. And the state-of-the-art review should be a systematic literature review focused on the device indication and the target population. So basically, the clinical evaluation of your device will be benchmarked against the current state-of-the-art. State-of-the-art review determines how your risk-benefit ratio and risk mitigation hold up relative to other treatment options. As per the EU MDR, the acceptability of the benefit risk profile is based on the state-of-the-art treatments. So your state-of-the-art literature review has many touch points. As mentioned previously, you can benchmark against alternative treatments in your risk management. You can contextualize your risk-benefit profile, and it serves to have plays into the acceptability of the risk-benefit ratio. Can provide rationale for equivalence and demonstration of equivalence. And it also sets standards for your safety and performance endpoints with regards to clinical investigations, clinical evaluation, and post-marketing activities such as post-marketing surveillance and post-marketing clinical follow-up. Scientific literature is still relevant even if conducting clinical investigations. The relevance of clinical investigations should be described in the context of the state-of-the-art of clinical practice. Post-market surveillance system is another area where systematic literature reviews are extremely important. According to the EU MDR, the post-market surveillance system shall be suited to actively and systematically gathering, recording, and analyzing relevant data. And PMS regularly generates new data. For example, from safety reports, as well as from results from published literature. Thus, you will need to embed the systematic scientific literature review into your post-marketing surveillance plans. Another area, post-market clinical follow-up, similar to post-marketing surveillance. Post-marketing clinical follow-up is actually part of post-marketing surveillance. Manufacturers are required to collect post-market clinical follow-up data to assess potential safety risks. This process continues throughout the life cycle of a product and contributes to the continuous evaluation process. Possible routes of PMCF studies, according to the EU MDR, include gathering of clinical experience gained, feedback from users, and screening of scientific literature and of other sources of clinical data. Now we're going to move from the application of systematic literature reviews to the different target EU MDR areas to discussing the importance of continuity and interconnectivity. So it's very important to have a life cycle approach when doing any type of regular systematic evidence synthesis. You need to ensure interconnectivity of key areas. Your plans should predefine the entire system. Evaluations and investigations should be executed based on those plans. Post-marketing activities should inform and update the evaluations. And all of this should be benchmarked against your current state of the art. So overall, you're building a living system that is continuously updating and improving itself. The following diagram is a nice way to have a visual of the EU MDR device life cycle. So we start with the clinical evaluation plan, which leads to clinical evaluations that are reported in the clinical evaluation report. Following the clinical evaluation is the post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up activities. All of these feed into the risk-benefit analysis, and then the process is restarted. So as we can see, the systematic literature review is included throughout the product lifecycle and regularly needs to be performed. So what is the life cycle of the device? The life cycle of a device is the duration of time a device has been on the market, or the duration of time a device is in contact with the patient, whichever is the longest. We'll just leave this up for a second. People are often curious to how long this process has to go for. So when to update your clinical evaluation? The clinical evaluation report is actively updated when the manufacturer receives new information from post-marketing surveillance that has the potential to change the current evaluation. Post-marketing, as I mentioned previously, post-marketing surveillance and post-marketing clinical follow-up should be actively feeding back into your evaluation. If no such information is received, then at least annually if the device carries significant risks or is not yet well established, or every 2 to 5 years if the device is not expected to carry significant risks and is well established. In this case, justification needs to be provided to the notified body. We move from continuity to transparency. Opening the EU MDR Declaration has 8 mentions of transparency. There's detailed requirements that need to be met for the notified bodies. And these include a complete clinical evaluation process, PMS, PMCF, literature search methodology, relevant documentation, etc. Notified bodies will want to see what you've done, and there could be unannounced audits. And the most important thing is to aim to make everything replicable. I'm going to talk a little bit here about optimizing transparency of scientific literature. You have to clearly communicate all of your plans and processes, provide a thorough and objective methodology and stick to it. You need to predefine your literature search protocol. The search strategy should be comprehensive, documented, and justified. Mimi spoke about this earlier. Safety and performance outcomes should be defined a priori. You must identify, appraise, and analyze both favorable and unfavorable data. And if deviations are required, they should be clearly stated and justified. Part of transparency in the systematic literature review is the PRISMA flowchart. This is where you find a summary of the scientific articles included and excluded from the review at various different steps in the review process. Transparency of scientific literature also includes provision of supporting documents. Be generous in your provision of documentation. The Medical Device Coordination Group makes mention of providing literature search protocols, literature search reports, a full list of retrieved articles, full list of excluded studies with reason for exclusion, full text of included articles, etc. So I want to talk a little bit now about the benefits of using systematic review software such as Rayyan. There's very many benefits, and they all relate to things that we've discussed in our session today with regards to comprehensiveness, regards to efficiency, transparency, continuity. Benefits of using a software solution to your systematic reviews include a complete data management solution, which is equal to an audit solution. Increased efficiency and expediency of the review process, increasing visibility of an already screened, yet to be screened citations, ability to highlight key terms for inclusion and exclusion, ability to electronically capture notes or labels for references, guidance for subsequent references on the basis of prior decision, provides inter-rater reliability scoring, and the ability to deduplicate your scientific articles. As Mimi mentioned and Bob mentioned earlier, Rayyan is a partner of ours, and they have an excellent systematic review software solution. Key takeaways to our webinar today. Systematic reviews are powerful at every level. I think we've shown so many examples of where the systematic review informs the regulatory process and how important it is to have a comprehensive solution, a transparent solution, a continuous solution. So they deliver a comprehensive overview of available evidence on a given topic. They identify gaps in our understanding of the field. They identify methodological limitations in the current evidence base that then inform future research in a meaningful way. They identify questions that available evidence can answer, minimizing the need for further redundant research. And they provide the gold standard of evidence that is high quality, relevant, accessible, and up to date to healthcare decision makers. And lastly, systematic review methodology minimizes bias. Thank you. That's my last slide, our last slide.
Thank you very much, Mimi and Isabella. That's very informative, and it really illustrates just how much complexity there is associated with completing these evidence synthesis reports in order to satisfy existing and ever-changing regulations. And so what I've learned today is that it's a continuous process. So you comply once, and then you're going to be in a continuous process of compliance as the evidence base changes, as you're assessing the risk of your solution in the market, and in order to comply with the various cycles of reporting that are required. I guess the first question is, it's very high stakes for pharma companies, medical device companies, biotech companies, all who are trying to deliver to market important health interventions and solutions and products that treat patients for their conditions. And what's at stake for them is really their financial future. If they're unable to comply with regulation, they're unable to keep their products or bring their products to market. And there's potential liabilities with not producing the type of evidence that shows their products are safe. Have you had experience with customers who have been struggling with this process and have come to you in the middle of a process or at the start of a process, or even having failed at successfully meeting compliance objectives? And how do you work with them? And if you could talk a little bit about that process in terms of how you engage with these various different stakeholders and what you can do for them.
So I can field that question. So we have had the new EU MDR regulations, as I'll give as an example, because it's a really good example. And the new device regulations are requiring medical device companies to do systematic literature reviews, both as part of their clinical evaluation process, as part of their post-marketing surveillance process, and to establish the state-of-the-art to which they're supposed to benchmark their risk-benefit ratio against. So we have had cases where they've come to us because the notified bodies now have a checklist for how a systematic review needs to be conducted. And a lot of these companies aren't meeting that checklist, and they're failing their audits, frankly. And they're coming to us and asking us for help to remediate the literature review and to bring it up to standard, which is often a huge lift initially. What companies need to realize is once they make that lift, it's a lot easier to keep it going, to update it on a regular basis. But initially, there is a big lift that's required to get everything up to date, to undergo split, because often the literature reviews, if you're starting from now, they have to go back to when the device first came on the market. But we've also had some cases where we know that products have been lost from the market, and in some cases it's unfortunate because it's a product that maybe was of benefit to the public, but the cost of the lift just wasn't worth it to keep the product on the market. So there's some interesting take homes from that as well.
Thank you, Isabella. It's very interesting and enlightening, and it is very high stakes apparently. If these companies are not able to maintain their products in the market, there's quite a lot at stake for them financially. How early should they come to you to prevent these sort of, no pun intended, adverse outcomes in terms of their planning being a critical part of getting started on this road? When is too early or when is too late to start planning for these things, and how soon should they be talking to you?
There isn't anything such thing as too early as possible, I think, is the answer, because the reality is that there usually is not the in-house expertise on doing the systematic reviews. And a lot of these companies, they have not had experience with this previously, and they go about it in a wrongful way. They're using a general literature review approach, and a lot of the elements of the systematic review are missing. And once they get to the notified body, their submissions are being sent back for modification. And yes, as early as possible, I think that would save a lot of time and money overall, and having the process being done correctly from the start. And then also there's the possibility for knowledge translation in giving that knowledge to the regulatory groups, and then they can carry on and doing things according to proper standards.
Right. I would just add in terms of there's really never too late either, right? Because whenever a systematic review effort is initiated, right, it's providing really valuable information in terms of guidance for that regulated company. So there's no ceiling for improvement. And the systematic reviews are just a very prescribed methodological source of information for companies to identify next steps in an evidence-based foundation. And what I would add is, right, something for, I don't know how many people on the phone have experienced this, but depending on how politically charged an initiative is, this product launch or product continuation or product review, that can really, I know that we've seen instances in the US where some of the guidance or comments from the FDA seem to be more politically charged than evidence-based justified. That's when I have found systematic reviews particularly useful, because the foundation of the methodology was grounded in as unbiased a review of a given evidence base as possible. And just to follow up on one point Isabella made about conducting these internally, what I would say is that most often, whether it's at the academic level or industry level, right, having an outside group conduct your systematic reviews also minimizes bias, right? And those of us who have been trained in systematic reviews from an evidence-based practice center framework understand that it's great for the review team because you end up being experts across a very broad spectrum of therapeutic areas, but the systematic review methodology lends itself to that. So we may know nothing about X therapeutic area. By the time we go through this evidence synthesis process, what we do know backwards, front, up, side to side is that relevant given evidence base. And that's really where the outside review team comes to be especially valuable.
You raised an excellent point. And how would many medical device companies or biotech companies or single product companies, they're commercializing some innovative therapeutic or intervention, and they form a company around it. So it could be a one product company, so their entire financial fortune is at stake in the success of that. It could be their first time doing this. How does somebody who's an executive in one of these firms and those who are tasked with meeting these compliance regulations, how do they assess their ability to actually carry out these regulatory compliant evidence synthesis projects on their own? What does a typical systematic review team look like in terms of who's involved, how many people involved? You mentioned something about a domain expertise that needs to be involved or acquired along the way, and even the third-party relationship adding an element or quality of bias reduction, where the company reporting is involving a third party so that the evidence could perhaps be not only more professionally produced by people who are experienced, but have the added benefit of being at a third party relationship. So there's an assumption of reduced bias, at least implicit in that dynamic. Could you talk about the resource requirements? How does an executive or a person tasked with this really assess what's required to do this before they get started?
So I can just briefly speak to that a little bit. And then with my experience, the size of the team is really related to the budget and the size of the company. Unfortunately, some of these smaller companies and startup companies are dealing with a one-man show, trying to do the systematic literature review and then mediating or mitigating that review against notified bodies' comments and pulling in outsourcing as needed to try to fill the gaps. Whereas larger review teams are able to provide higher quality and systematic reviews are often in larger companies. And so they're trying to meet that bar for notified bodies with as least a resource investment as possible. And obviously for the smaller companies, they're trying to do that with even less resources. And the bigger companies are manning up, but they're still trying to cut costs as much as possible. And it's a back and forth with the notified bodies on the minimum requirements. For example, do you need 2 reviewers or just 1? That is something that the notified bodies are not really yet clear on. And if the company sense that they can get away with 1 reviewer, they try to cut costs. So just speaking to that in that, I think there is no set standard yet. There is still some movement in the rigorness around a systematic review, but for sure the standard goes a lot farther than just grabbing a bunch of papers and summarizing them like you would in a landscape review article. But are they doing full level academic reviews in industry? Not quite. And there's still some gray area there about how much they need as far as resources internally and externally. And I think there's a little bit more forgiveness for smaller companies, the startup companies, but at the same time that they are becoming more scrutinous around that. If that helps to answer your question at all.
It certainly does, and what it strikes me is, Isabella, is that it's a legal compliance, right? There's a regulator, and you're complying with regulations. So there's a legal aspect to this that if I were an executive and making this sort of decision, I would look at this much like the way I would look at legal, right? Do you do your own legal, or do you hire lawyers who are versed in the laws and stay up to date? And so the same way I allocate budgets to legal, and I don't do DIY legal because of all the liabilities that introduces, and I have shareholders and stakeholders and others that I have to protect in the process, that immediately I would look at it in that same frame and say that much we don't do DIY legal, we don't necessarily want to engage in DIY evidence synthesis, bet the whole country's future, delay timelines, miss getting to market sooner, getting approved, and having it done right the first time, where what's at stake is success or failure. Timelines could already be stretched out by the nature of, especially if we're in the pharma space, but where you're already going through extended timelines of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that it could be a very expensive lesson, and one that you find out after the waste and expense and liability and everything else has been incurred. But as Mimi pointed out, it's never too late to go get help. That as soon as you discover that it is more than you can handle, that there are folks out there that can assist with this complexity and organize the whole process and be an extension of your organization on an ongoing basis to help you maintain your compliance. Much like you have company counsel, you have company evidence synthesis teams as augmenting your core team. And that can alleviate the burden of internal experts who might be needed in other areas of the company where their expertise in the process, in terms of understanding the solution, could be better devoted towards the science of what your solution is really all about and improving that, especially if you're taxing your scientists in ways that you don't need to be to really solve what is essentially a legal and regulatory issue. It's been very informative for me in that way, and I'm sure that for the rest of the audience, I do want to get to some questions. One question we have, and we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, was the rapid rise of the rapid review, and that you guys have touched upon this throughout your presentation. There are areas of ambiguity, right? That the regulator they don't say it explicitly, how do you know how to deal with it? And because of the urgency around the health crisis posed by a global pandemic, folks were releasing their manuscripts, preprints, if we want to call them that, prior to a full peer review process. How do you know which evidence to trust? And when does that become a liability in your compliance reporting?
You want me to take that, Isabella? Sure. What I would say, the first thing is rapid reviews, yet another type of review. As I stated, even in the comparison of narrative versus systematic, just having a clear understanding of the differences is going to be key. So that's not to say that because these were provided preprint outside of peer review that there isn't value, but from a methodological perspective, there are tools out there that are valid and reliable that are used to assess those reviews. And without any judgment of any of those reviews, right, there's certainly there's been an explosion of systematic reviews in all of the subcategories, right, over the past several years. What we can be grateful for is that there are appraisal tools out there for those reviews. And that's where I would go first. Isabella, do you have anything to add?
Just that a rapid review is not a systematic review, right? So it has to be put into context. So it's better than a narrative review, and there is a place for a rapid review, and obviously the COVID-19 pandemic was that place. We needed information, we needed it fast. And it was working within the framework, but it had to be, it had to be taken for what it was, which was a rapid review and not a full-blown systematic review. So there is room for rapid reviews out there, but it's definitely not a full-blown systematic review.
So this brings us back to the hierarchy of evidence and the quality assurance measures that you guys can implement to basically normalize the different types of evidence that you're finding within the literature as you conduct the reviews. That brings me to a second question, which is, if you're planning for a systematic review and you're aware that there are RCTs on the topic available, where does and of course RCTs, randomized controlled trials, perhaps sit just below meta analyses and systematic reviews in terms of the quality of evidence, but you don't obviously trust the results of a single study, and that's the reason for doing a systematic review, is to get the best available evidence by reviewing all the available evidence. And going down the evidence pyramid, you might also then look at observational studies. But how would you position observational studies within the framework of systematic reviews? Is it prudent to strictly adhere to RCTs, or should you go further down the evidence pyramid?
It's a topic we like. Yeah, I'm happy to discuss. We've encountered this many times. And generally speaking, what we've done, we all have to acknowledge RCTs are considered a gold standard of study design, right? And they rate higher than observational studies. However, right, part of our approach has also been to not dismiss a significant portion of the evidence base. It's driven by the evidence base, but in terms of just very literal terms, for example, observational studies could be reported in your supplementary section. It's just demonstrating the comprehensiveness, but it really depends on what impact, what role those observational studies play in the given evidence base.
And what if the literature is very thin? You have a really new sort of area of research, and your intervention, your therapeutic, whether it's a medical device or, it's biotech or pharma, how far down the evidence pyramid is acceptable, right? In a lot of systematic reviews, people throw out case reports because it's an individual case, right? And there's not enough participants or patients to rely on that evidence. How far is reasonable or acceptable within a regulatory compliant evidence synthesis report?
Yeah, I think there's cases where, what we've done systematic reviews in rare diseases, and there's areas where getting all of the evidence, even if it's a low level of evidence, is the best approach, because you want to have the full evidence, the base. And if that in cases where it's difficult to get evidence or not a lot of evidence is out there, and for instance, like rare diseases, then you can even go right down to the case report level to build your evidence as best as possible.
Right, but the key is clearly reporting with transparency and replicability, right? What that evidence, the state of that evidence base, right?
So it's a relative approach to things that requires adaptation based on what it is that you're studying and what the available literature is.
Yeah.
I know I'm just looking at the time now, and I think we've addressed all the questions that we have so far. If there are any other questions, we can wait around. Otherwise, I do want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to thank our speakers. Thank you, Isabella and Mimi. And if you have further questions for us and want to reach out to us, we'd be happy to hear from you and follow up and learn about your evidence synthesis needs and how we can help. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and we look forward to staying in touch very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.